The ground beneath Naples is splitting open. Not slowly, not gradually. 8 kilometers of rock fracturing in real time beneath one of Europe's most densely populated regions. This is the story they're not telling you. This is the discovery that changes everything. February 15, 2025. 1653 UTC. The seismic network at Italy's National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology registers the first tremor. Within 72 hours, that single earthquake becomes 556. 556 earthquakes in 3 days. The strongest hitting magnitude 3.9. Schools close. Emergency shelters open. 40,000 residents brace for evacuation. But here's what the public statements aren't saying. Here's what the data is screaming from 8 kilometers below the surface. The earthquakes aren't random. They're not scattered. They're forming a line, a pathway, a corridor of fractured rock stretching from the Campi Flegrei caldera directly toward Mount Vesuvius. 25 kilometers. That's the distance between these two volcanic systems. And that distance is collapsing. Scientists at the University of Salerno discovered it first. Satellite radar data analyzed through machine learning. Ground displacement patterns that shouldn't be possible. When Campi Flegrei rises, Vesuvius contracts. When pressure builds beneath Pozzuoli, deformation appears 25 kilometers east. The two systems aren't separate. They never were. At 8 to 10 kilometers depth, beneath the entire Neapolitan volcanic district, lies a shared magma accumulation layer. A reservoir. One reservoir feeding 2 volcanoes. And right now, that reservoir is active. Let's understand what this means. Campi Flegrei, the Phlegrean fields. In Greek mythology, the entrance to the underworld. Not a single volcano, but a 13-kilometer-wide caldera. A volcanic crater so massive that the city of Pozzuoli sits entirely within it. 500,000 people living inside an active volcanic caldera. Another 3 million within the expanded threat zone. 39,000 years ago, Campi Flegrei erupted with a magnitude that blocked out the sun across Europe. 72 cubic miles of molten rock ejected into the atmosphere. Global temperatures plummeted. The eruption that scientists call the Campanian ignimbrite. Evidence of that ash found as far as Russia. Then, 15,000 years ago, it happened again. The Neapolitan yellow tuff eruption. 40 cubic kilometers of material blasted into the sky. The caldera we see today formed from these catastrophic collapses. Vesuvius, 25 kilometers to the east. The volcano that destroyed Pompeii in 79 AD. The volcano that erupted continuously until 1944. Dormant since then. Green alert level. Quiet. Or so we thought. Here's the mechanism. Here's how the connection works. Deep magma migration. Fluid transfer through crustal fractures. When pressure increases in the Campi Flegrei, magma reservoir at depth, magmatic fluids and carbon dioxide migrate laterally, eastward, toward Vesuvius. Travel speeds up to 300 meters per day have been confirmed in crustal fracture systems. The satellite data proves it. From 1993 to 2010, during Campi Flegrei's transition from subsidence to uplift, a deep volume beneath Vesuvius contracted. Simultaneously, the same pressure changes, the same timing, the same source triggering both systems. Since 2005, Campi Flegrei has been in continuous unrest. Ground uplift accelerating. At the port of Pozzuoli, Roman columns that once stood underwater now tower above the beach. Ancient mollusks fossilized halfway up the stone pillars, proof of how dramatically the land has risen. Boats that once floated now rest on grass. The ground has lifted 133 centimeters, 4 feet, 4 inches of vertical displacement in the center of Pozzuoli, and it is accelerating. 2 centimeters per month as of November 2024. The earthquakes follow the uplift. 2,500 earthquakes in a single month during 2024. Then came June 30, 2025. Magnitude 4.6. The strongest earthquake at Campi Flegrei in modern recorded history. strong enough to crack walls across Pozzuoli, strong enough to trigger a landslide at Punta Panada that sent rock masses into the Gulf of Pozzuoli, creating localized tsunamis. Then, February 2025. The Swarm. 556 earthquakes in 72 hours. Not subsiding, not stopping. Building. Machine learning analysis of seismic data expanded the earthquake catalog from 12,000 detected events to 54,000. 42,000 earthquakes missed by traditional monitoring. The enhanced data revealed something critical: a sharply defined ring fault system. Faults illuminated by seismicity forming a nearly perfect circle around the caldera's perimeter. Shallow faults in the northern caldera sector lighting up with activity. And the depth. 90% of the earthquakes occurring in the first 2 kilometers, above 3.7 kilometers depth. No deep seismic activity on the ring fault. Not yet. Here's what that means. The pressure source driving the unrest sits below the seismic activity, deeper than 4 kilometers, likely at 6 to 8 kilometers depth. And analysis from 2007 to 2023 shows that source has been rising, from 6 kilometers depth to approximately 4 kilometers. Magma ascending through the crust. Not hypothetical, observed. Petrological simulations confirm it. The same volume change can be produced in 2 ways. Either massive gas release from a large magma body at shallow depth, or a smaller volume of magma rising from deeper levels. But all models point to the same conclusion: direct magmatic involvement. Magma, from 8 kilometers depth, is ascending, feeding the shallow pressure source that's lifting Pozzuoli. Now the domino effect. Now the cascade. Increased fluid pressure at Campi Flegrei means increased fluid migration through the connecting fracture network. That fluid, that magma, that carbon dioxide, it doesn't stop at the caldera boundary. It flows along the shared 8-kilometer deep magmatic layer toward Vesuvius. What happens when fluid pressure increases beneath a dormant volcano? What happens when carbon dioxide, which scientists now recognize as a fault lubricant, infiltrates fracture systems beneath Vesuvius? Reactivation potential, destabilization. Vesuvius has been quiet since 1944, 81 years of dormancy. But dormancy is not extinction. The magma chamber beneath Vesuvius remains. The plumbing system remains. And if that system receives pressurized input from a connected source 25 kilometers west, dormancy becomes irrelevant. The population at risk. 3.5 million people live in the red zone around both volcanic systems combined. The Neapolitan metropolitan area. 8,000 people per square kilometer. One of the highest population densities in Europe, situated directly atop interconnected active volcanoes. Evacuation protocols exist. On paper. Plans to evacuate 500,000 people from Campi Flegrei's red zone within 72 hours of a confirmed pre-eruptive signal. But what constitutes a confirmed signal? The ongoing uplift? The magnitude 4.6 earthquake? The 556 earthquake swarm? Officials remain paralyzed by uncertainty. False alarms erode trust. Missed alarms cost lives. The 1980s crisis saw 40,000 people evacuated from Pozzuoli after 6 feet of ground uplift and a magnitude 4 earthquake. The evacuations lasted months. Buildings were condemned, families displaced, and the eruption never came. Not in the 1980s, not in the 1970s, not in the 1950s. Every major unrest episode in the past century ended without eruption. But here's what makes this different. Here's why 2025 is not 1984. The confirmed presence of rising magma. The seismic evidence of a pressurized source ascending from depth. The satellite data showing deformation patterns consistent with magmatic injection, not just hydrothermal activity. And the connection. The proven hydraulic link between Campi Flegrei and Vesuvius. If Campi Flegrei erupts, what happens to Vesuvius? If pressure releases catastrophically at one location, does that trigger release at the connected location? History suggests yes. Analysis of the 16th century shows that Vesuvius activity intersected with Campi Flegrei activity. When one system showed signs of unrest, the other followed. Not coincidence. Interaction. The eruption scenarios. For Campi Flegrei, experts predict a VEI 4 or 5 eruption if activity escalates. Smaller than the prehistoric super eruptions, but large enough to bury Naples under ash, halt air travel across Europe, and displace millions. Pyroclastic flows. Ashfall. Lahars. Infrastructure collapse. For Vesuvius, a Plinian eruption similar to 79 AD remains possible. The type of eruption that obliterated Pompeii and Herculaneum within hours. If both erupt simultaneously or in sequence, the cascading failures become unmanageable. Evacuation routes blocked by ashfall. Airports closed. Ports unusable. 3.5 million people trapped in a volcanic crisis zone with no clear path to safety. The government response. Italy's civil protection minister appointed a special commissioner to oversee risk prevention measures. Volunteer emergency responders deployed. Temporary shelters established in Pozzuoli, Boccoli, and Naples. Structural inspections of buildings ongoing. Schools closed during high seismicity. But these are reactive measures. Preparations for a disaster already unfolding. The scientific community remains divided. Some researchers argue the tremors result from superheated water and gas, not rising magma. They point to the lack of deep seismic activity below 3.7 kilometers on the ring fault as evidence that magma isn't breaching the shallow crust. Yet, they emphasize that past unrest episodes resolved without eruption. They caution against alarmism. Others warn that all signs point to magmatic unrest. The deformation patterns, the geochemical changes in fumarole gases, the exponential increase in seismicity since 2014, the satellite evidence of interconnected deformation between Campi Flegrei and Vesuvius. They argue that the current episode differs fundamentally from past crises, that the weakened crust from repeated intrusions makes rupture more likely, that magma may reach the surface without the typical precursory signals. Stanford researchers discovered that the unrest could potentially be managed by controlling groundwater levels and water runoff, reducing pressure in the geothermal reservoir beneath Pozzuoli. But implementation of such interventions requires time, resources, and political will, none of which exist in abundance during an active crisis. Meanwhile, the ground continues to rise, 2 centimeters per month, 24 centimeters per year. The earthquakes continue. Magnitude 3, magnitude 4, hundreds of smaller events daily. The faults continue to illuminate. The ring fault system continues to define itself through seismicity. And the 8-kilometer deep connection between Campi Flegrei and Vesuvius remains active. What happens next? That's the question no one can answer with certainty. Will the unrest subside as it did in the 1950s, 1970s, and 1980s? Will the rising magma stall at depth, unable to breach the final kilometers to the surface? Or will the accumulating pressure find release? And if it finds release at Campi Flegrei, does the pressure wave propagate along the shared magmatic layer to Vesuvius? Does one eruption trigger two? Does the collapse of one system destabilize the other? 3.5 million people live with these questions. 3.5 million people watch the seismographs. Watch the ground rise beneath their feet. Watch the ancient columns emerge from the sea. Watch the cracks spread through their buildings. And wait. The connection is proven. The pathway exists. 8 kilometers deep, 25 kilometers long, linking 2 of Europe's most dangerous volcanoes beneath one of its most populated regions. The ground is speaking. The data is clear. The only question remaining is whether we're listening. Are we watching the prelude to the next great Mediterranean catastrophe? Or are we witnessing another cycle in the breathing of a restless giant? The scientists don't know, the government doesn't know, and the 3.5 million people living in the shadow of these volcanoes can only wait for the answer. The ground continues to crack. The pathway continues to open. And beneath Pozzuoli, beneath Naples, beneath the entire Campanian volcanic province, something is rising.